Hello, everyone. It's October 14, 2022. We're in meeting 20. We're in our second discussion of Chapter 8. We have a few topics and points in Chapter 8, and then maybe we can preview some Chapter 9 and have a lot of space for any other thoughts or questions people are having. So we can jump to the questions and look at the written Chapter 8 questions, or does anyone want to suggest a point for us to go to? Last time, we know that some of the areas we wanted to pick up on involved learning and hierarchical modeling and hybrid modeling. One question that came up, I think, here, but maybe we can revisit, is the birdsong model is widely pointed at as an example of how communication is modeled in active inference or for active inference entities. However, it's quite literally singing from the same hymn sheet, and the turn taking is based upon a joint expectation of that song being sung that way. And then the actions that the birds can take, the kind of turn taking that they enact, is, again, it's related to whether it's like, well, somebody has to say it. Is it going to be me or is it going to be them? So how do you think we would broaden that scope of communication to account for situations where there isn't a pre-scripted song? How do other frameworks for communication, cybernetic-ish or otherwise, deal with the semantics of conversation, improvisation, open-endedness in conversation?
Actually, I had a somewhat more general question about the bird songs and its relation to these particular systems that they've developed in the textbook. You see, some researchers believe that, I'm sure you're much qualified to talk about this than me, but there are lots of research going around about the territorialization function of bird songs. So if we take that as if we take a bird song as its territorializing mechanism, at least one of its territorializing mechanism, can we somehow put the dynamic, the dynamic boundary of the markup blanket, I think, would be affected from this point of view. And then I'm not sure how that would translate into this specific model if we take that dynamic nature of the markup blanket boundary.
Yeah, I guess I would just build on that and say that the communication serves a purpose, and so I think a model should incorporate what that purpose is and how it's served by the communication, and then whether it happens to be syncing up with some predefined pattern or whatever is a follow-on consideration.
The generative model in the Singing from the Same Hymn sheet is very much like the sheet music example provided in the textbook. There's a known sheet music script such that even when there's like an error in the playing of the music, still the sheet music can be heard. So just coarsely, what generative models, I think it's pretty straightforward to see how a generative model could have the notation or the sheet music, and then use the sheet music as its prior to kind of converge reality. To what extent is communication that way? Is it totally disparate and differently structured, or is it a little bit like a hybrid, like you're doing inference on the sheet music that they're about to say, and then you use your inference about what they're about to say to converge what they do say?
Well, you asked a good question, which is, well, what are some alternative frameworks? And I know I know some or should know some, and they're not coming to mind. What comes to mind most immediately in this example is a phase lock loop in electronics, which is simply a way of synchronizing one circuit's oscillation with another. And this is like a phase lock loop with a bigger vocabulary. So figure out where we are in the pattern, and then synchronize with it. And but to the question of what other frameworks, I mean, there's a whole field of conversation analysis, which well, the field's actually called CA, conversation analysis, and they have identified patterns of how people communicate through certain structure of, I guess we call them rhetorical devices for achieving the purpose of the conversation. So the purpose of the communication is kind of bedrock, but and there are multiple purposes. Some of which are instrumental, some of which are social. And then they have identified patterns for the way human conversation tends to proceed, which are culturally influenced. There's some cross-cultural aspects, but then there's certain different cultures that have different takes on it. So they identify things like, okay, now we're in the conversation opening phase. Now we're in the phase of turn where we're exchanging information and we have turn taking. Now we have notions of epistemic leadership or epistemic authority. Who's the person who's asking, who's the person who's answering, or taking those roles in the conversation, and there's certain rhetorical stances that are taken. Then we have that's a pretty well worked out. I guess even formalized system, because there are well identified patterns. It's not strictly worked out because it seems like every domain a conversation analyst goes to, and every group has their own kind of flavor of it. But it is kind of it does have this aspect of synchronizing with respect to the underlying known patterns of each of the parties in the conversation.
Birdsong is also... Oh, Ollie, please.
Sorry, adding to what Eric just mentioned, that reminded me of a mechanism on a much smaller scale, namely the scale of cells and so on, and particularly the model proposed by Stuart Kaufman, because he talks about the pluripotent nature of cells and how they communicate with each other in the context of phenomena of induction, biological induction. I mean, in the embryological development stage of the cells, almost all cells are pluripotent, and they're capable of becoming any of the different types of cells which characterize the adult individual. So that also, from Kaufman's model perspective, these kind of inductive signals, or so to speak, communicative signals between cells, can act as a kind of non-specific stimulus, which switch a cell among a variety of internally available stable states. I mean, a cell, or let's put it this way, the basic idea in this model is that the regulatory genes within a cell form a complex network in which genes interacting by their products can turn one another on or off. You see, so these patterns exhibit the kind of homeostatic stability associated with attractors of the systems. So I think that translates perfectly into this scale as well. This is small.
Yeah, the mapping of communication as generalized synchrony may be compatible with a variety of communication mechanisms. And so it abstracts us from the media of communication per se, because we can talk about the informational synchronizations between, for example, the two internal states of the two entities, or multilateral synchronizations with environmental states or so on. Like thinking about the Bayesian mechanics, Bayesian physics, the synchronizing metronomes. They don't have a hymn sheet. They don't have sheet music. Their embodiment and coupling enables synchronization.
One thing I might know, I think you asked a good question here, which is, how would you translate something like conversation analysis, or human conversation into an active inference model? So that kind of reminds me that the continuous valued models, because they're limited by these by what you can do in these differential equations, they seem to be fairly simple. Whereas if I were to do something like thinking about human conversation in terms of active inference, I would want something more, a very high dimensional or multi-state type of system, where I can have more complex patterns. And they may not make these, loops, these Volterra loops, or is that what they call Volterra? Is that right? Or is this Lorentz? Something dynamics?
Yeah,
it may
Volterra
not.
And the Lorentz.
Yeah. So it may not make those continuous loops, but you'd still get good structured patterns out of discrete systems. So I'd kind of be curious, and I think this chapter would be cool if it had a something about communication and synchrony, pattern synchrony, but in terms of discrete valued active inference models instead of the continuous valued ones.
Yeah, very interesting. Like, that's what I was wondering, which is why is communication is continuous time models are argued to be a natural fit for motor control. Are communication situations naturally fit for one or the other seems like
I mean,
no, you could
yeah,
imagine it either way. And then also like the synchronization means the internal state of one creature should come to resolve the resemble internal states of another, a primitive kind of theory of mind. I think not as a fatal critique, but these examples put the rabbit in the hat a little bit too keenly. Like the planning example we explored wasn't truly planning. It was like a parameterized subspace where single step optimization emulated planning. And one could argue that they believe that that's actually like a better approach than true explicit planning, but that's not what was on the cover. And then similarly, theory of mind, though qualitatively may be a framing for communication, we're talking still about the bird song where they have the same shared a priori generative model. So this doesn't, in other words, theory of mind is axiomatically and implicitly embedded within this model, rather than active inference being used as an a priori first principles to generate some realized computational theory of mind. I feel like, yeah,
yeah, it's like another aspect of this, the continuous valued formulations is there's really not that many degrees of freedom. But when you're communicating, anything other than a fixed song, there's a lot of degrees of freedom, and that's why we have symbol systems. But symbol systems is where you would use a discrete model framework for, not a continuous valued one.
okay. Let's talk about hybrid models, discrete and continuous models, and learning and updating. So these are two features. Chapter 8 is within a continuous time framework, just like chapter 7 layered in these kind of patterns or archetypes of discrete time models. In chapter 8, analogously, the most kernel continuous time formalism is introduced with movement control. And then we're going to see some kind of extensions or patterns, like design patterns that include continuous time. This is the message passing. Okay, so missing line here, but we have here, this top half is like the bottom of figure 4.3, or the top, I guess, discrete time. So we have B matrix as a transition matrix, we have discrete time, and we have, yeah, it's discrete time, t plus 1, t minus 1. But within each time point, we see the continuous time, E, whatever we want to call this motif, where the B transition matrix in discrete time is functionally substituted with a derivative map, such that rather than actually retro or forecasting state values through time, this is much more like a Taylor series approximation, where extrapolation from the present under the auspices of slower changing causes V, which play a functional role of policies, higher derivatives capture more and more variance further and further from the origin. What is the eta doing? It's playing some functional role to G. Again, allowing for a line here, in the sense that it is selecting policy. but it's not policy that's being selected or discussed this way. But these slower changing factors that influence how the derivatives are made. But is eta a free energy variable? Let's just ask. Okay. What do people think about this type of hybrid modeling? How does this align with the previous decades of analog digital signals engineering and the interfaces, the digitalization of analog noise and signals, and so on?
Well, I'll lay off one thought if it's all right. So one of the things that active inference lets you do is look at a past trajectory and figure out how to interpret it in terms of your variable, your state variables. So you can essentially you look for the probability distribution over variables that optimizes the free energy, and that allows you to look back in time and reinterpret evidence because you get something new, and you get in light of new evidence. And then some of the earlier chapters they had this kind of example, and they had the example of a dynamic programming kind of a model for this. So I would expect that to be the case also in communication systems. And I guess I'm going back again to communication, where to some extent you're able to reinterpret what you thought you heard before. It's kind of rare in language, but it happens. There are garden path sentences. But usually, most communication systems try to be relatively hierarchical in that once you interpret your continuous value signal, then you don't leave a lot of ambiguity. You kind of fix on that, and then you have to deal with it later. And sometimes you go back and do repair. So I'm wondering if this figure 8.6, if that allows that kind of dynamics, where you're kind of tracking something at the continuous value level. You're tracking a signal, Y effectively, by making predictions of what you're going to hear, what you observe. And then is that able in this framework to go and influence the symbol level, the B, the S variables above, and how far back in time is it able to do that?
Nice. That makes me think about phonemes down here and audio. And then here are the spellings. So in a language, or someone is speaking unclearly, or you're not super familiar with a language, then you really are like doing inference on the whole time series. Like it's like that kind of retrocasting, which can include even revisionism and delusions and false memories and all of that. Now casting, including the tension between representing things, quote, as they are versus like having delusions in the present. And then anticipation, which of course hasn't even happened unless you have a vision of time as, something that always was, or however. So it's really interesting that although this time t is an index, we are doing inference across these. And maybe it would speak to some measure of information processing and memory and anticipation, the extent to which like meaning is able to be, the closer meaning is to a critical point, like the more this graph structure, if someone says da 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 da, but I was just kidding, you would want that to apply to be like, oh, I didn't know I was in a parentheses, and now that they were just kidding about that. So it's actually like delineating those structural markers and then reinterpreting meaning is perhaps moving towards the kind of linguistic modeling. So yeah, to come back to it. So this could be a waveform. The observables down here could be just a Fourier analysis or a pure auditory waveform.
Yeah, I think the phonemes is that's what comes to mind also.
Okay. Okay. Ocular motor tasks. So selecting a target location and using motor behavior functionally, eyes, to foveate the target. Figure 8.7. Okay, so figure 8.7 is a hybrid or mixed generative model. Higher level is this is kind of like the decision making, motor, active inference, fusion. Here we have a little bit of the italics and bold, which we could dive into but don't need to do so at this moment.
So, my recollection for last week was that corresponded to generative model versus process model. Do you think that might map again here? I know you didn't want to dive into it, but I just did.
I believe it does. Let's just remind ourselves where it came up earlier in the chapter. Yeah, it was the very beginning. Right here. Yeah. With italics versus process in bold, model in italics. Okay, so 8.7. So now here, the discrete model is on a time period of 200 milliseconds. Continuous model operates continuously. I think this speaks to how biological knowledge can be encoded in the model structure. I mean, a more comprehensive approach would have done parameter sweeps for what the optimal number of milliseconds is to do a discrete model on. However, one could say like, well, the physiology that we're interested in is accomplished with a gamma EEG cycle. The gamma EEG cycle is this many milliseconds. So we're just going to treat that as like a discrete rhythm. Like one can imagine if the discrete time were 1 millisecond here, you would be losing computational advantage and you'd be kind of like overslicing. Because if eye movement does happen on a time scale of hundreds of milliseconds, discretizing to 1 millisecond is going to be too fine. And discretizing to 1 second is not going to enable multiple actions to be taken within that frame. So time scale and spatial scale of a system might be able to be encoded at the phase of its construction or structure learning more generally. Okay. Gaussian mixture model and the hierarchical. Yeah.
Sorry, before we move on, just about the isocods. I don't understand what is gained by an active inference model for this. I mean, why not just say you got a controller and it's a control loop and that's good enough?
Yes. In live stream number 50, which we're just preparing for, it's like very classical cybernetic control loop, homeostatic dynamics. And it's interesting to ask, like, again, what makes the model active inference? One could say that there's a Markov blanket, but we're, between every one of these variables, it is a model of action and perception like so many other models of action and perception. So what is being shown here? Is it that the single imperative, that energy-based imperatives, just speaking narrowly here, energy-based imperatives can mediate decision-making in discrete, continuous hybrid models? And that it's possible to have a categorical decision-making model in feedback with a continuous ocular motor model? At the very least, it places this type of model within the domain and grammar of active inference modeling. Okay, data clustering we may have touched upon. Also, a hierarchical Gaussian filter that I know some people have worked on. Okay, let's look at some of the summary advances in continuous time models. Synthetic birdsong. We talked about this. Ocular motor delays. Conditioned reflex. That's okay. So this is in the chapter. This is in the chapter. I don't know about this exact paper, perhaps, but ocular motor is in the chapter. And smooth eye pursuits. Conditioned reflexes. That is in this chapter. The blink, the conditioned and the unconditioned stimuli. Building on the songbird model, but the songbird model was in 2015. False inference from suboptimal prior beliefs. Can prior beliefs be suboptimal?
Sorry. Actually, Friston has talked about bird songs before 2015 in one of his papers, I think from 2013 or 12. Yeah, it's from 2013, which is co-authored with his son, I guess, Dominic A. Friston. So yeah, I mean, 2015 paper was not the first paper. Okay. The name of the paper is the free energy formulation of music generation and perception.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, this one.
Wow. Yeah. Good. Fine reminder. Interesting. Looks very much like the textbook. Opening quotes. I can see how this is related to your researching too. Okay. Oh, maybe even 2009 Birdsong, Chaotic Attractors. Wow. It's 10 plus years on the Birdsong paradigm. Okay. So, deviations in perception. More eye movement. It's kind of fun, like how we've talked about babbling and that across different domains, like cicading. there's the ocular motor cicade, but are there other kinds of cicadings? For example, I think that knowledge management niches facilitate semantic cicading. Yes, enabled by visual cicading as well, because you have to be like looking around on the page. But it's just like, oh, what was chapter 4? Oh, okay, okay, that's what we were talking about, chapter 4. What's notation? I think it's just sort of like the analog to scanning around a little bit. But just having...
And in conversational analysis, that's a very important topic, is topic control. And or if you look at any, most conversations have multiple threads going. So it's like a fugue in, Bach. Okay, which voice is this? Every note is in a voice, and the voice has got some topic, and they intertwine.
In Gödel, Escher, Bach, prelude, ant fugue. Nice. This is very interesting. I think it starts to plant some seeds towards, again, semantic cicading, computational conversation, analysis and generation, adaptive knowledge environments. Like visual accessibility is one topic. If somebody has a visual difference, then making sure that they can see it is the enabling system. But let's just assume that we're within a space where we can talk about what is being seen. So then, how does someone get a clear picture of what we're talking about? That would be through some sort of cicade, where you'd recognize more uncertainty at the periphery, and like the fovea in this case is paying attention to the conversation. And that's why, like, with a language we're unfamiliar with, we get a little bit lost, because like our cicade, we're too slow. We don't have the fluency to cicade, and so the video is moving too fast to track. So we're just kind of like randomly listening and like trying to like compute. But what if somebody were on a guided cicade journey through their semantic landscape?
I mean, just to take this a little bit further, this is also maybe, it's a critical element of cognitive architecture, which is the ability to topic switch. And, in psychology and cognitive science, there's this notion of executive control. And one of the fundamentals of executive control is to be able to topic switch. So you're on some task, you get an interrupt, you have to put that on a stack, deal with your interrupt. Then when you're done, and maybe the interrupt is a goal, it could be a sub goal, it could be some other topic that comes in, something you have to deal with. Then when you're done, you have to be able to pull that back, push that back off the stack, and get back to where you were. So all that context switching is really, I mean, there's measures of how people do this, and there's debates about whether people can multitask or not, whether they're actually really multitasking or they're just multi-threading, but they're dividing the amount of computational process by the number of processes you have going. So you're actually not doing multiple things at once as effectively as if you just stuck with one. So, yeah, anyway.
And then it's like, do we have that Intel hyperthreading capacity? Is it a virtualized hyperthread on one thread? Are there actually different threads? Yeah, I mean, the conversation analysis, other than us being right in the thick of it and it being highly engaging, it's an important area. Let's just continue through these cases here. Action observation. Okay. Mirror neurons. This may be very much related to the birdsong, singing from the same hymn sheet or whatever, and then like, doing the same dance. Okay, attention. This is a super fascinating area, and I think a lot of notebooks and applications, like just taking a trace of somebody's browsing on Wikipedia or across websites, and then reconstructing components of their generative model based upon their salience revealed choice is a huge area. And then doing, again, that with the ocular motor with webcams, and doing it with semantic landscapes. Hybrid modeling, self-organization, arguably with some pretty interesting advances in the last several months and days from Fields and Levin and others on the, and four-staged earlier, but on the morphogenesis as Bayesian inference. Okay, in our last few minutes here, let's just look ahead to 9, because I think this is setting us up well. Okay. Model-based data analysis, or data-based modeling, or however we want to say this, is about parameterizing structured models with observations. So rather than just by fiat dictate saying this is the structure of the model and it spits out observations like so-and-so, we want to be able to actually run it backwards, not as a generative model, but as a recognition model, so to speak, in this expectation maximization framework, and parameterize our generative model from sparse or dense observations. And that's also called parametric empirical Bayes, because you're parameterizing the prior based upon the mean and variance and patterns of some empirical data. Okay, the Metabayesian approach. Bayes theorem. This may even be something that could be introduced earlier, even though it's also meta. This is like the map territory fallacy graphical abstract, which is we're making a map. Here's us in the bigger box, even though there's a dashed box even beyond us. We're making a map of a cognitive entity in its map making of its generative process. And that was the subject also of some very rich discussion several days ago with Jakob and Ali and Dalton. Ali, anything to add on this?
No, nothing much, but one general comment I wanted to make about chapter 9 is that you see, because of my project that I've been working on for the past several months, this chapter 9 has been quite helpful in developing some of my ideas around how to exactly model my I mean, the music emotional recognition system that I've been working on. But I wanted to point out one small caveat here, which is that, you see, at least in my opinion, Chapter 9, or this so-called model-based data analysis, is not conducive to generate every, on every model that's been described throughout the book. It's just focused on some specific kinds of models, so it might not be generalizable to every kind of model that we've seen throughout all the previous chapters.
Good point. Some models might be just plug and play, so to speak, and other ones might take a little bit more work to get to use empirically. Okay, let's just continue in our last minutes to scan through. So, Metabayesian process, we're drawing inferences about an inferential process. It's a key point And that's the two levels of mapping. It's like the map of the map. Variational Laplace. Variational Bayes, factorized models for computational simplicity and interpretability based upon the sparsity of coupling of variables in a Bayes graph. And Laplace using a parabolic approximator of the mode and a variance to ensure a simple optimizable heuristic. Not that it perfectly recapitulates the shape of the posterior, which doesn't have to be inverted quadratic, but the Laplace approximation is smoothly optimizable for both the mode and the variance. And here's where they mentioned that's the parametric empirical Bayesian approach. And basically, Laplace approximation can be thought of as making a commitment to the quadratic form. So choosing the family that your prior is going to be of. And then bootstrapping your initial prior with your observed data. Bootstrapping not in the resampling sense, but in the starting oneself out sense. This was explored more in other works, but you have some likelihood function of all the parameters L of data and optimizing action involves computing beliefs about policy such that policies are proportionally taking up slices of the pie monotonically with respect to their free energy. And then there's a precision on action parameter where you can turn it all the way down to sort of like don't know, don't care, where even large differences in free energy between policies get equilibrated out. That's like hot decision making. And then absolute zero decision making would be a policy that's even 51% more likely would be always selected. So the variational free energy, expected free energy, it's a bound on surprise due to Jensen's inequality and evidence lower bound and all this other work in variational inference. And then that pie slicing can be tuned up or down with a shaky hand parameter. Softmax temperature parameter. If the softmax is 1, the pie is undistorted. If the softmax is large, you have a relentless bias for better policies. Or it can be less than 1. Here's some technical details of the Laplace approximation. Parametric empirical Bayes. Generalized linear modeling. Hashtag SPM. Here's recipe. So this is kind of like chapter 6, but now it's model-based data analysis. Collect behavioral data. Maybe the data has already been collected. Maybe there's some data sets that we already can use. Formulate a POMDP. I wonder if this is as chapter 6, not as chapter 7. It could be chapter 7 as well, if it's discrete time. Specify likelihood. Perhaps we can, in the coming weeks, check out SPM MDP VBX. And they mention the scripts. Data, this is nice. This will be fun. Chapter 7, I mean, it is the correct if they're using this type. 4. Chapter 7, chapter 4. So, this looks pretty cool, pretty interesting. We could walk through some examples. false inference. Computational pathology. So it kind of ends like chapter 8 with a table of references and a summary. So it's a pretty short chapter and has some formalisms, but it's only from page 179 in the PDF to 196. So it's less than 20 pages. And
the next chapter, I think, is the longest chapter in the book.
Which one is?
Chapter 10.
Chapter 10. 197. Yeah, that one's over 30 pages. Yeah. But it ends on a high note. All right. Well, interesting conversations. Thanks for this. We will come back to chapter 9, look through it, and then peep into 10, go through 10 and really solidify our understanding of the map and, I guess, indirectly of the territory. And then for those who want to join, we'll probably continue the discussion and especially start looking towards those project ideas again. Like we talked just a little earlier about making a .0 sessions for the textbook.
So I have to apologize. I'm traveling for a few weeks, so I'm going to miss the next several sessions.
It's all good. Thank you, Eric. Any other comments people want to make, or I'll close the recording? Okay. Thank you.